This hearing will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Before I deliver my opening remarks, I wanted to note that the committee is meeting both in person and virtually. I want to announce a couple of reminders to the members about the conduct of this hearing. First, members and staff who are attending in person may choose to be masked, but it is not a requirement. However, any individuals with symptoms, a positive test, or exposure to someone with COVID-19 should wear a mask while present. Members who are attending virtually should keep their video feed on as long as they are present in the hearing. Members are responsible for their own microphones. And please also keep your microphones muted unless you're speaking. Finally, if members have documents they wish to submit for the record, please email them to the committee clerk, whose email address has been circulated prior to the meeting. Well, good morning and welcome to our members and witnesses. Thank you for joining us for this important hearing on open source software security. Cybersecurity is certainly an evergreen issue, and today we're focusing on an important and often overlooked corner of the ecosystem. Open source software is software that's freely available for anyone to use and modify. It's the hidden workforce of the digital ecosystem, and it's part of software ranging from standalone browsers to complex commercial operating systems. It's also common in scientific research. For example, Fermi's National Accelerator Lab, where I worked for many years as a physicist, recently announced the development of open source software to support the control electronics of quantum computers. Even if you're not working with a quantum computer this afternoon, it's safe to say that anyone who's used a computer has relied on open source software, whether they know it or not. And yet, despite its importance, open source software only seems to draw attention when something goes wrong. In 2014, the Heartbleed vulnerability in OpenSSL prompted a surge of concern and some action to save open source software, as on the parts of industry and government alike. Good work was done in response to that vulnerability, but interest soon waned, as it often does in Congress and government. And in many ways, we find ourselves in the same situation now that we were in back then. This past winter, the open source community was once again rocked by a dangerous vulnerability, the Log4j project, and its vulnerability, sometimes referred to as Log4Shell, reminded everyone about the dangers of neglecting open source software. The sheer breadth of organizations affected by that vulnerability in a single piece of software drove home just how much everyone relies on open source. The open source generally is an interesting example of the tragedy of the commons. You have the free rider problem. It's something where normally you would simply say this is a public good and make everyone bear the burden. For some packages which are really relied on universally, then that's probably a good model. But there are difficulties because not everyone benefits equally from special attention being paid to different packages and so on. So I look forward to trying to get a little deeper in the weeds on how we might decide how to prioritize and where to put our effort and who's to take responsibility for specific packages. It's a tough set of weeds to get into. This hearing is not meant to look back at the hows and whys of Log4j. Others, including other congressional committees, have already done a good job of that. Instead, this hearing will look forward. It will explore how industry and government can cooperate to make sure open source has resources commensurate with its importance. Those resources are not just financial, but also include technical capabilities, volunteer efforts, and administrative and organizational contributions. This hearing is also an opportunity to look at some of the dangers of open source that are looming on the horizon. Open source software is not just in traditional computers, it's in our drones, our AI models, and yes, even our quantum computers. We need to fully understand how open source resources are used in developing technologies to properly assess the risks that those uses represent. It's important to remember that no software is ever completely secure, just as, for instance, Windows and iOS will certainly be hacked many times in the future. There will also be other open source software vulnerabilities. Rather than seeking perfection, our goal is to structure how we think about open source and how we identify the most critical pieces of open source software for prioritization and how we secure that software against intrusion or blunders. If we do that, we will be able to mitigate both the risk of future vulnerabilities and the damage caused when vulnerabilities are exploited. In a world where our technology so often comes with hidden drawbacks or more hidden motivations, open source software often seems to be a charmingly utopian exception. At its best, it's simply good-hearted people creating software out of their own passions and sharing out of a desire for others to benefit from the fruits of that labor. It empowers people of all backgrounds and all levels of technical ability to build upon the work of others and find or make software more suited to their needs. There's something wonderful about that. I hope that through our conversation with our witnesses here, we can contribute to the future of safe and secure open source software. So I have a letter here from GitHub which I'd like to enter into the record, and without objection, it is so ordered. And the chair will now recognize our ranking member and perhaps the other AI programmer in the U.S. Congress, ranking member Overnolte.
Thank you very much, Chairman Foster. Thank you for Chair Stevens for convening this very important hearing on a topic that is very close to my heart and I think is of critical importance in ensuring the future cybersecurity of software in the United States. We all know that open source software has had a tremendously beneficial impact on software development here in the United States. The very nature of open source software, where we encourage collaboration and reuse of code, I think enhances the efficiency of software development here. But it also comes with inherent risks, and I think as time goes by and different vulnerabilities are exposed, we're learning more and more about those risks. The fact that the code is out there for anyone to see means that malign actors can look at that code and identify vulnerabilities that they might not have seen if they just knew that a software was operating on the code and didn't have access to the code itself. So we've known about those vulnerabilities. What we're going to hear about in the hearing today is some other vulnerabilities that have come to light, in particular supply chain vulnerabilities where malign actors might intentionally introduce vulnerabilities in software in the hopes that it's incorporated downstream later when software applications based on those modules are built. That's something that's relatively new in our understanding of open source software and cybersecurity. It's something we certainly need to be on guard against. We're going to hear from the Air Force on their Project One platform, which I think has introduced some really innovative and useful technologies to cope with those vulnerabilities. And also I'm very interested in today to hear from some of our experts about a new type of vulnerability that deals with the ubiquity of artificial intelligence now in open source software. AI, particularly that based on machine learning, as we know, depends on massive data sets to train AI algorithms, and we're starting to be aware of vulnerabilities that could be caused by manipulation of those data sets. In fact, the statistics are pretty alarming that just changing a small amount of the instances in those data sets can cause very serious problems to occur in the implementation of that artificial intelligence. And a malign actor could introduce an intentional error in the data set that's intended to cause a specific problem. So these are all things that I'm really happy that we're going to be hearing about in this hearing. And I'm hoping that, as the chairman also articulated, I'm hoping that we can identify some ways that government can be helpful in solving some of these problems. You know, there's some concern in the open source community that the heavy hand of government could have a very deleterious effect on the adoption of open source software. You know, the whole community that has led to open source is about collaboration and transparency. And the moment we take the heavy hand of government down in the form of regulation on that industry, I think we run the very risk of causing problems. But I think we also have a role to play as government. We have vast resources at our disposal. We have amazing people that work in the various branches of our federal government and of our NGOs. So we have a lot of talent and tools that we can bring to bear on this problem. So I'm hoping that hearings like this one will be instrumental in catalyzing a very effective and useful adoption of some of the tools that government has to bear on this problem of cybersecurity. And I think it is possible to have a Goldilocks solution where government is here to help and not to hurt. So with that, I'm looking very much forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you, and the chair will now recognize Ms. Stevens for an opening statement.
Well, good morning, and welcome to this joint hearing of the Subcommittee on Research and Technology and the Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight on Securing the Digital Commons, Improving the Health of the Open Source Software Ecosystem. What a delightful and exciting topic. I'd like to certainly thank my esteemed colleagues, Chairman and Dr. Foster and Ranking Member Obernolte for leading this timely and needed hearing. A supply chain, as they say, is only as strong as its weakest link. And the times when the weakest link happens to be cybersecurity, we see devastating ripple effects and wide-ranging aftershocks. We can no longer operate off of yesterday's mindset and only view supply chain cybersecurity as an IT problem. In order to strengthen America's collective cybersecurity, we must examine all the vulnerable links in the supply chain. I am deeply proud to be here today to encourage Congress to explore various avenues the government can engage the open source community to identify and remedy vulnerabilities, the open source community of which I have hailed from in my previous professional career. 1 year ago, President Biden released an executive order called Improving the Nation's Cybersecurity. This executive order tasked the National Institute of Standards and Technology, a fan favorite of this committee, to create essential standards for critical software, software supply chain risk management, among other tasks. In the coming days, NIST is expected to publish its final piece of guidance required by the executive order. But the agency's work to secure the nation's software is obviously far from finished. One aspect of supply chain security we need to take is an in-depth look at open source vulnerability landscapes. Many leading companies and organizations don't recognize how many aspects of their critical infrastructure depend on open source. Open source software code is available to the public for anyone to use, modify, or inspect. Many elements of NIST software guidance can be applied to open source software, such as secure software development frameworks. However, they do not address many of the unique challenges inherent in the open source software ecosystem, from inadequate resourcing to vulnerability detection and mitigation. So the point is we don't want to hinder innovation. We just want to do it right, and we don't want to make ourselves vulnerable in the process of innovating. A vibrant open source ecosystem is an engine to the U.S. competitiveness and growth. The ecosystem benefits Americans every day, including in my home state of Michigan. During the pandemic, open source applications tracked open hospital beds and helped Michiganders access food for their families when schools were closed. It's the first call I made. Open source platforms responding to the urgency and needs brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. But certainly there remains real risk if we leave critical open source software vulnerable to attack. As both the Heartbleed and Log4j incidents have revealed, open source software issues can be a threat to our federal agencies and businesses across the country. There's good work underway, but still much more the U.S. scientific enterprise can do to secure open source software repositories. Last year, I introduced the NIST for the Future Act, which is part of the America Competes Act, and we will hopefully send that to the President's desk soon. This bill would require NIST to expand its current efforts by assigning severity metrics to vulnerabilities in open source software and producing voluntary guidance to help entities that maintain this software to secure it. The National Science Foundation plays an important role in funding many open source software and data repositories. NSF is planned to award grants to help secure elements of the open source ecosystem as part of its new program, Pathways to Enable Open Source Ecosystems. Gosh, I wish more people could hear that, because it's also called POSE. I am encouraged by these efforts, which will be further bolstered once we enact and fund the NSF for the Future Act, which is also in Competes. Securing open source software is fundamentally a resource problem. I believe the federal government can play a role identifying vulnerabilities, providing resources where industry might not, and providing long-term structural security improvements throughout the open source ecosystem. These efforts are most effective when done in coordination and collaboration with the private sector. I welcome the recommendations of this expert panel. I again thank my colleagues for convening us, and certainly the recommendations on how to improve the coordination between the public and private sector, which are forthcoming. And again, thank you to our witnesses. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And the chair will now recognize Mr. Feenstra for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Foster and Chairwoman Stevens. Thank you for your passion, and Ranking Member Obernolte, thank you for being here today at this hearing. I also want to thank our expert witnesses for participating today. I look forward to the discussion and learning more about ways to improve open source software security. Open source software is a key component to modern software development. Over the past 2 decades, open source software has become widely adopted and has a vast number of applications, from powering our small personal devices to our supercomputers. Open source software is largely created by volunteers on their own time who often do not receive any sort of compensation for their work, but rather work on projects that they are passionate about and that are make useful to others. It is collaborative in nature, as it is available for anyone to use, modify, and share for best usability and accessibility. Additionally, open source software is often available free of charge, which allows users to have access to technological capabilities that they may not be able to otherwise. While open source software offers many benefits, there are also risks involved in using these types of software. One of the main challenges of open source software is the lack of dedicated resources for security and internal vulnerability checks. If open source software has security vulnerability, it could cause widespread harm to all users. What's more, because open source software is typically part of another software component, it may be tough to determine when and where a patch may be needed. Critical technologies such as artificial intelligence often have their own unique challenges when it comes to open source software security. For example, large data sets are used to train artificial intelligence systems to improve their accuracy. If malicious actors manipulate or poison these data sets, the models will be corrupted and could produce inaccurate and harmful outcomes. Federal science agencies are actively working to address some of the ongoing challenges to open source software security. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, has developed standards and best practices that apply to open source software. NIST also produced guidance for managing compromised cyber supply chains and fixing vulnerabilities. On May 12, 2021, the President issued an executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity to enhance the security and integrity of the software supply chain. The executive order required NIST to create new security standards for software, including open source software. The National Science Foundation also recently launched a new program called Pathways to Enable Open Source Ecosystem, POSE, to harness the power of open source development for the creation of new technology solutions. Additionally, many NSF-funded research projects produce open source software, hardware, or data platforms that perform further innovation. It is important that security risks to the open source ecosystem are adequately addressed and that the necessary resources are dedicated to bolstering cybersecurity. Improving our nation's cybersecurity is particularly important to me. My district has recently been targeted by malicious cyber attacks to our agricultural supply chain. I hope we can have a productive discussion today about improving security in open source software without compromising its benefits. I once again want to thank the witnesses for being here to discuss this important topic, and I look forward to hearing your solutions. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And if there are other members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Ms. Lauren Knausenberger. Ms. Knausenberger is the Chief Information Officer of the Department of the Air Force, comprised of the Air Force and Space Force. Ms. Knausenberger leads 2 directorates and supports 20,000 cyber operations and support personnel around the globe. She provides oversight of the Air Force's information technology portfolio, including the information technology investment strategy from networks to cloud computing. Prior to joining the Air Force, she was a founder and president of a consulting firm specializing in commercial technologies that could be applied to the government's missions. After Ms. Knausenberger is Mr. Brian Behlendorf. Mr. Behlendorf is the general manager of the Open Source Security Foundation, a project hosted by the Linux Foundation with the goal of securing the open source ecosystem. He has served as an advisor on open source to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Mr. Behlendorf was the founding volunteer president of the Apache Software Foundation and serves on the board of directors of the Mozilla Foundation and the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Our third witness is Ms. Amélie Koran. Ms. Koran is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative. During her 30-year career, she has supported work across government agencies, including the U.S. Department of the Interior, the Treasury Department, and the Office of the Inspector General within the Department of Health and Human Services. In 2014, she was detailed to the Executive Office of the President to support the federal CIO in reviewing cybersecurity legislation. She was one of the original co-founders of the U.S. Digital Service and part of the Presidential Management Council's rotation program. And our final witness is Dr. Andrew Lohn. Mr. Lohn is a senior fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, or CSET, where he works on the Cyber AI project. And prior to joining CSET, he was an information scientist at the RAND Corporation, where he led research focusing mainly on cybersecurity and artificial intelligence. Andrews also worked in materials science and nanotechnology at Sandia National Labs, NASA, and Hewlett-Packard Labs. He's published in a variety of fields, and his work has been covered in the MIT Technology Review and by the BBC. And as our witnesses should know, you will each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in its entirety in the record for the hearing. When you have all completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will then have 5 minutes to question the panel. And so now we will start with Ms. Knausenberger.
Good morning, Chairman Foster, Chairwoman Stevens, Ranking Member Obernolte, Ranking Member Feenstra, and distinguished members of these committees. Thank you for inviting me today to discuss the benefits of open source and how we can work together as a whole of society to enhance open source cybersecurity. As an aside, I will share that our software development community was very energized to hear that we have members who can write AI algorithms and create esports games, as well as a collection of technologists and enthusiasts who are asking about this topic and raising it to the level of national attention. So thank you for that. I will share that a few weeks ago, I was impressed and perhaps a bit humbled seeing the way that Starlink handled the communication issues in the Ukraine, and specifically that they were able to defeat Russian jamming in Ukraine to solve problems with code and to push capability halfway around the world to keep the Ukrainians connected. And these were code pushes that were done in days. If we were looking at this in a military context and trying to bring code around the world to push it to a pristine, disconnected weapon system, it often would take us much longer to do this. Now, that same level of speed that we saw with Starlink, or better, is needed to protect our country from emerging threats like hypersonic missiles, and to ensure that we can stay ahead of the actions of our adversaries and in lockstep with our allies. It is entirely possible that a future conflict to preserve our way of life is decided by features, fixes, and updates to software-intensive systems that must take place in minutes or hours. And this means that we must learn quickly as a department and leverage the knowledge and best practices of the entire development community. Now, first, I want to share that I personally am very bullish on open source software. It's an incredible community of people, as a few of you have mentioned in your opening statements, that want to drive maximum benefit for all. And the top developers and companies in the world are using it and contributing back to open source. And those companies include Google, Microsoft, Red Hat, and Intel as the world's top 4 contributors to open source. And if you go and speak with those companies and the developers in those companies, they are actually spending a good percentage of their time contributing back to open source that they use because they want to make sure that it is maintained and that it is secure and that they can leverage it for the commercial capabilities that they layer on top of that open source technology. It's transparent. You can see the code base. You can even see how the developers go through thinking about how they'll fix a particular bug and the online dialogue around fixing adding a particular feature. It is often more secure, in my opinion, because it is thoroughly reviewed and vetted by the community, as well as battle tested by companies around the world. And when there is an issue, it's fixed quickly and openly. If I compare and contrast SolarWinds and Log4j, it was found pretty quickly by the community. It was fixed pretty quickly. The whole process was very transparent. There was open dialogue. If we look at SolarWinds, it took us a while to figure out that there was a problem. There were multiple steps, and it did take longer to push those fixes. Open source allows us to keep costs down by allowing reuse of very good code, and it avoids vendor lock while allowing the best developers who want to work with us to partner with us. I'll also posit that open source software has come a long way, especially over the last few years, and I can give credit somewhat to the open source, the OpenSSF, as well as the Linux Foundation for their focus on it, as well as just general awareness among the software community about the importance of cybersecurity, as well as the incredible visibility given to vulnerabilities in our national press as well. Now, while I see the benefits of open source, we in the Department of Defense, we do need to doubly ensure the integrity of the code that we use, as well as ensure that we provide valuable contributions back to the open source community without giving away protected information critical to our competitive advantage. And those 2 points were outlined in a recent memo by John Sherman, as we put more on the record that we as the Department of Defense are embracing open source software in policy. We do see it as our responsibility to independently scan and test all code that we use, whether that is commercial code, whether that is open source code, and we take this very seriously in the department, that we maintain awareness of what software is on our networks, that we scan that software, and that we update it to the best of our ability. Now, historically, our development teams had to do this independently. An individual development team would pull code from an open source repository or code that was developed by that team. It would go through the pipeline, and that team would be independently responsible for ensuring that that code was updated and secure. We launched Iron Bank as part of Platform One to help our development teams to do this more efficiently and more consistently across the entire department, as well as to open it up to the broader community. And we have had at least one commercial bank pulling containers from Iron Bank, as well as some Fortune 500 players. The intent there is to make sure that the code is secure and current and containerized, that it is accredited for use, which is often a challenge within the Department of Defense, and that it is available to that community. And further, even after we've done all of these checks within our development environments, we still have a pretty active program for bug bounties, for vulnerability disclosures, and active hacking events where we have on multiple occasions had hackers come in to do a gray hat or white hat review of our systems. They have found vulnerabilities in open source software, and they have contributed back to the community. We've also had instances where we found dependencies that were previously unknown and contributed back because we are putting a lot of rigor into the checks that we go through. And I see this as really one of the big benefits that we as a Department of Defense bring to the open source community. So in our business, the adversary consistently gets a vote. It's not just about market share for us, it's about winning, it's about maintaining our competitive advantage as a nation, and it's about ensuring our way of life. We must drive the time and tempo to deliver the capabilities that we need to win, and I thank you again for the opportunity to testify this morning. I welcome your questions.
Thank you. And next is Mr. Behlendorf.
Chairman Foster, Chairwoman Stevens, ranking members Obernolte and Feenstra, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to speak today. Open source software is deeply embedded inside every software product, digital platform, smart device, and industrial machinery we have. Our markets, our energy grid, our transport systems, all the conveniences of the modern world would not function without open source software. Open source comes to us not exclusively or even primarily from a small number of large companies, as we might think, but from a constellation of different organizations and individuals whose collective efforts are combined and remixed by the thousands into the products and services we see as consumers. Let's pause for a moment and note just how awesome it is, given so many other problems we have in this world when we try to work together, that this kind of decentralized global effort is able to produce anything useful at all, let alone the bedrock foundation for the digital products and services upon which we live our lives. And yet, for all these different components from different teams and sources, they're built using methods that vary tremendously and in ways that affect the quality and security of each piece, and thus of the whole. Open source software as a whole has an excellent reputation for security, and some projects prioritize earning that reputation. A recent study from Google's Project Zero found that the Linux operating system kernel fixed security holes in an average of 15 days during 2021. But another recent study from Sonatype found that 29% of major open source projects contain known security vulnerabilities, either in themselves or in the code that they require to function, their dependencies. But this isn't just about defects in software. As we've heard, supply chain attacks on the way that developers and companies assemble and package and distribute their code on top of many other dependencies, and then get to the end users, those kinds of attacks are on the rise. Several incidents over the last few years have led the open source community to organize an array of different efforts to address the many underlying root causes that have combined to create the situation we're in. The OpenSSF is home to many of these efforts, as I detail further in my written testimony. We are running programs and building solutions that bring greater trust and resiliency to the way that software flows through a supply chain, through projects like SigStore, which focuses on digital signatures for software artifacts, and SALSA, which tracks levels of process in a supply chain. We are distributing educational materials that teach the fundamentals of secure software development, something that few developers learn until late in their careers. We're also working to identify the most critical software packages and measure them for security practices that can mitigate the risk of future major bugs. And if they aren't doing that work themselves, offer to help them do it. We are promoting the use of third-party audits to discover the architectural mistakes, the product misfeatures, and implementation oopsies that an attacker can wormhole through to get the goods, and much more. But we need help. The bad news is there is a lot of work to do, and a lot of different kinds of work is needed, as I've just given a list. The good news is we know what that work is, and we've got some proven tools and techniques that can scale up if the resources are made available. The great news is the returns on that investment are super scalable, as those returns accrue to everybody using open source software. You fix a hole once and everybody benefits, no matter where you come from, how much you've paid, all of that. If we focus those investments on the projects that are most critical and most widely depended upon, and perhaps the ones that are least well-resourced, we can have a truly global impact. In my written testimony, I offered some advice on how the federal government can productively engage with the open source software community on this topic. For this testimony, I'd like to talk about some of the specific lines of effort that we are pursuing that would benefit from alignment with government efforts and opportunities. Briefly, they include expanding education on secure software development fundamentals. How do we get that everywhere, into every formal education around computer science and every informal opportunity developers have to become better coders? How to help, we'd love to explore how to help industry develop better metrics and benchmarks for measuring cyber risk in software itself. How do we know if we're succeeding at improving the state of security in software? We'd like to see a push for more supply chain integrity standards and tools, from SBOMs, which there's been great leadership on, to digital signatures and more, using procurement policy as a driver for change. We'd love to see a push for modern techniques, such as memory-safe languages that can eliminate entire categories of software vulnerabilities. And we'd also love to see help with funding third-party code reviews for open source projects. Think of them as audits, but the good kind. The good news is we're seeing a very proactive stance on this topic from the White House. The recent series of executive orders and interagency efforts among the NSC, ONCD, OMB, OSTP, DOE, HHS, and everybody has been really great to see. We're also really happy to see the interest from all of you on this topic. I believe the people and the systems that can drive systemic change are in place, but those efforts across both the public and private sector are currently resourced at a small fraction of what's needed to really solve the problem. There's so much to do. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And next is Ms. Koran.
Good morning, Chairman Foster and Chairwoman Stevens and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. While my written statement has the full details, I would like to summarize them for you here. I'm Amélie, non-resident senior fellow in the Cybersecurity Initiative at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here with Dr. Lohn, Mr. Behlendorf, and Ms. Knausenberger. The Cyberstatecraft Initiative strives to address strategic questions by combining systems analysis, policymaker engagement, and the operational experience of our interdisciplinary practitioner community. My views and perspectives expressed to you today come from the point of a contributor to open source projects, a technician who's worked in operating and securing systems and critical infrastructure, and one lucky enough to experience all of this from both within the public and private sectors at various levels, as well as in different industries over the past quarter century. To quickly touch on the overarching questions posed to us by the subcommittee, none of what you ask of us, the open source community, or the agencies and programs you oversee can be easily answered, but there are ways to make it progressively better than its current state. First, realize that computer code is as much as part of our modern infrastructure that supports our country, the same way more visibly tangible physical infrastructure like roads, bridges, dams, and utility plants are. However, there's a level of creativity and free expression involved that underpins how it's created, maintained, and used. It can be torn apart and excerpted, used in whole cloth as a complete package, or glued together with thousands of other pieces of code to achieve an end goal of building a system that thousands, millions, or billions of people use and rely on. Addressing the security of this code, particularly that which is developed to be shared and improved upon by primarily volunteer developers in an open and transparent fashion, is why we're here to discuss the best ways for which this committee, through its actions, can support its health and long-term viability. While the Log4j vulnerability last year was the wake-up call that created this renewed focus, it was far from the first. Looking back a few years to Apache Struts, it was an open source package utilized by data broker Equifax, whose lack of following good maintenance and configuration best practices resulted in the loss of millions of individuals' personal data. This was an issue that could have been avoided by utilizing proper frameworks, guidance, and other non-technical methodologies on how to properly manage and use and integrate that code into the digital environments. Prior to that, in 2014, the Heartbleed vulnerability found within an open source software package used to secure the transmissions of communications across the internet was a project that lacked resources and sustainable governance to ensure something that did not actively introduce flaws into its critical code base. Open source software is one of the great, often unacknowledged resources that allowed our modern society to advance and innovate like at no other time in its history through the adoption of openly available shared technology in our economy and daily lives. It seems very easy to try to solve such issues by imposing regulations, more checklist-based compliance requirements, which tries to mask itself as security, or even turning away from using open source software altogether. Just don't. This is an addressable problem through creative thinking, collaboration, and leveraging the best parts of industry, academia, and government, along with international partners, to get this ecosystem to a point where it's healthy, sustainable, and most of all, trustable. Much like modern software development practices, everything should be iterative. And in my written testimony, I'm specific in saying the goal is to do the most good, which is not to try to solve it at first swipe, but align things in such a way that they head in the right direction and make our course corrects as we go along. Have government resources partner with organizations like the Open Source Security Foundation to leverage the interfaces into critical infrastructure through CISA and NIST, rather than have them reinvent the wheel and start a whole new line of engagements. Leverage the grant-making capabilities and appropriate oversight at various agencies to directly assist these types of foundations and efforts. It needs to do so agnostically through leveraging CISA's interfaces with sector coordination to identify and triage the most critical software packages that need these types of resources and efforts applied. Use NIST and the NSF to help develop, in conjunction with software stewardship foundations, such as the Linux and Apache Foundation and others, to help develop and refine standards and best practices. This should not end strictly at technical guidance, which should also address how developers and project staff can best maintain and govern the entire lifecycle of their software projects. This work should also include consumer education on how to responsibly use, integrate, and operate code sourced from these efforts, from the enterprise down to the individual consumers. Exploit that same experience and trust from within these agencies and programs to build and assist with integrating validation frameworks for open source projects deemed critical digital infrastructure, even if it's just helping pair needs with existing resources. Often it may just be awareness that they exist and they can have a measured positive effect. Finally, be aware that none of this will be a quick fix. It requires a consistent, reliable effort from every group I've mentioned and from each angle to ensure success, no matter how outwardly minor they may initially appear. Thank you all, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. And next is Dr. Lohn.
Thank you, Chairman Foster, Chairwoman Stevens, Ranking Member Obernolte, Ranking Member Feenstra, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Andrew Lohn, Senior Fellow in the Cyber AI Project at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. It's an honor to be here. During the next few minutes, I'd like to talk about the risks to the artificial intelligence supply chain. The AI community has been particularly open to sharing. For example, it cost $500,000 in 2.5 years to build the famous ImageNet dataset, but the professor who built it released it to everyone. Then Google and Facebook both released their powerful AI engines, and now thousands of the most powerful AI models are a quick download away. It's truly incredible, given that these models often range from thousands to millions of dollars to build, and that's just in the computing costs without even considering the expertise to design them. These data sets, models, and AI programming resources form the building blocks of today's AI systems. In much the same way that few bakers today grow their own grain or raise their own hens, most AI developers simply combine ready-made components, then tweak them for their new applications. Sometimes that whole process only needs a few lines of code and surprisingly little expertise. This is the approach that allowed Google Translate to improve their performance with just 1/1000th of the code. They trimmed from 500,000 lines of code down to just 500. That sharing has driven both scientific and economic progress, but it's also created an alluring target for attackers. For one, an attacker can subvert an AI system by altering the data. That could happen, for instance, by a nefarious online worker while they label the data sets, or by a hacker who sneaks into the victim's networks. Alternatively, if the attacker provides a fully trained model, then it can be very hard to find their manipulations. There's no good way to know if a downloaded model has a backdoor, and it turns out that those backdoors can survive even after the system has been adapted for a new task. A poisoned computer vision system might mistake certain objects, or a poisoned language model might not detect terrorist messages or a disinformation campaign if they use the attacker's secret code words. The programming resources for building AI systems are also vulnerable. Such systems can have thousands of contributors from around the globe writing millions of lines of code. Some of that code has been exploitable in the past, and some of it prioritizes speed or efficiency over security. For example, vision systems need images at a specific size, but the code to resize images allows attackers to swap one out for another. And lastly, these resources are only as secure as the organizations or systems that provide them. Today, the vast majority are hosted in the United States or its allies, but China is making a push to create state-of-the-art resources and the network infrastructure to provide them. If adversaries make the most capable models, or if they simply host them for download, then developers in the United States would face an unwelcome choice between capability and security. There are a few things that Congress can do now to help maximize the benefits of the sharing culture while limiting the security risks that come with it. One step is supporting efforts to provide trusted versions of these AI resources, such as through NIST or a national AI research resource. Funding is also needed to do the basic hygiene, cleanup, and audits that are important for security, but that attract few volunteers. Congress should consider requesting that organizations across the US government create a prioritized list of AI systems and resources used to build them. This list may be easier to create and maintain if those organizations are incentivized to collect a software bill of materials that lists the components in the software that the government buys or builds. And lastly, many of these AI systems are new, and so are the attacks on them. The government would benefit from augmenting their teams of defensive hackers and security specialists with the AI expertise to help discover security holes in our most important systems. This would also allow them to think of new creative ways to subvert those systems before our adversaries do. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And at this point, we will begin our first round of questions. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Now, digital identity management and digital ID and digital signatures are critical to prevent security breaches. This set of problems occurs really at two different levels. The first thing, during code development, the code developers need to be able to prove they are who they say they are for many obvious reasons. And secondly, during code execution, the so-called zero trust architecture that I think a lot of very secure environments are moving toward needs to continuously check the authorizing credentials of code components as they execute. And so, Mr. Behlendorf, in your testimony, you talk about the need to develop simple digital signature guidance and encourage the open source community to adopt it. Could you elaborate a little bit on the challenges there and how the federal government and governments around the world, at least the free democracies of the world, should approach this?
Yeah, well, we've had quite a few different systems for being able to sign emails, being able to sign digital artifacts of all sort, going back to PGP which started in the late 80s, early 90s. In fact, PGP and derivatives of it do form an important part of the last mile when it comes to validating that the packages you get from repositories are what they say they are. Many development teams sign them as well. And yet, for its length, PGP and GPG have not really reached the level of ubiquity across the software supply chains that have really been needed. So one of the projects at the OpenSSF is called Project SigStore, and this brings a much simpler approach to being able to get keys to sign an artifact and push it through the supply chain, ensuring that humans are actually the ones doing the signing, so that you get that check. And it's not, there are parts that are automated and appropriately, and other parts that do require human oversight to make that actually meaningful. This is something that's now picked up quite a bit of adoption. The major cloud container system called Kubernetes has now adopted it ubiquitously. It also interfaces nicely with other ID systems out there. I think the appropriate role for governments in general is to be supportive of these efforts that are emerging from the open source community. As always with digital identity, you do have this question of what are the roots of the public key infrastructure from which this come? And I would really encourage the government to look at the examples set by ICANN and its administration of the domain name system, or the CA browser form in its administration of the root certificates in web browsers, and see that there are approaches to managing trust at scale, and that these technologies will likely converge on that same kind of distributed systems for being able to manage the roots of that trust. Lots of other efforts going on. I'd be happy to share more in the fullness of time, but thank you for the question.
Yeah, and I think one of the toughest issues there is the sort of the root of identity, which I fear is always going to be an essential government function to make, essentially a list of legally traceable human beings for high security applications. And that's going to be something that the free democracies of the world are going to have to work together to make sure that that kind of identity system basically interoperates properly. Now, in terms of the other, the zero trust thing that I mentioned, last year the administration's executive order 14028 specifically called on federal agencies to develop a plan to implement zero trust architecture. The idea of zero trust is that a network will continuously check on a user to make sure that they are who they say they are, and that the software they're running carries that down through the system. And so that an adversary won't be able to just run amok once they gain access inside the system. So Ms. Knausenberger, Platform One has developed a zero trust software called Cloud Native Access Point, or CNAP. Can you talk about the lessons the Air Force has learned in implementing the system and how open source developers could utilize it?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. First, I will share that Zero Trust has been a huge priority for the Department of the Air Force as well as the Department of Defense, coming into the incoming budget cycle with a lot of really valuable pilots ongoing now. The Cloud Native Access Point has been one of the most mature and successful pilots that we have run, in that we've proven that we don't have to use the typical gated castle approach, which, as you noted, once you get an adversary into an older model, they can just move freely. We've shown that we can drive better performance, that we can drive greater speed, and that we can do so more securely. We've extensively red teamed the solution and continued to make improvements. We've also shown that we can move more quickly as we make those improvements. We do have a lot to do, I'd say, at the enterprise level on identity, but the Platform One team and our CNAP approach are very much leading the way to show us the realm of the possible.
Thank you. And my time is up, and I now recognize Mr. Obernolte for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to witnesses. It's been a fascinating hearing so far. Ms. Knausenberger, let me continue that line of questioning that Chairman Foster started on on Platform One. Obviously that's been the Department of Defense's answer to how to secure software that's built on open source. In particular, in your testimony, you mentioned Iron Bank, which is the Air Force's way of protecting against supply chain vulnerabilities, where a malicious actor might introduce intentionally a vulnerability in the hopes that it would be incorporated in an end product in a sensitive area. Can you talk a little bit about how that might be replicated for uses outside of the Department of Defense?
Certainly. So most private companies and most development teams do have a process for checking code that they bring in. They leverage their CI/CD pipeline, which typically would include things like static and dynamic code analysis, dependency checking, looking for secrets, fuzz testing. You know, there's a typical set of tools that different entities would go through to ensure the security of that code. The way that we've done it is, instead of pushing it out to independent development teams to do that however they have determined their best practices, to help them centrally by going through and doing things like ensuring the code came from where we thought it came from, scanning containers, scanning code, consistently looking at the hashing, automatically updating the containers, and providing that as a common repo where folks can point to that container in the repo and leverage that code. We have had Fortune 500 companies also use that, our repo, our containers. We have had one commercial bank use our containers. It is available to the public to use. And we have had some great contribution. Over 300 commercial entities have contributed back to ensuring that Iron Bank is continuously improves as well.
Great, thank you. That sounds like great work. Mr. Behlendorf, if I could throw a question your way. In your testimony, you mentioned memory-safe languages as being a promising area for reducing security risks. And I find that a very interesting topic, because the research on the number of security problems that are caused by memory safety violations is just stunning. There was a recent study that said that over 60% of all vulnerabilities in Apple software is as a result of memory problems. It's Microsoft estimates it's over 70% for Microsoft software, and Google says it's over 90% for Android vulnerabilities. So, you know, I think this is a really interesting conversation to be having. And obviously, using a memory-safe language would prohibit the kind of behavior that is causing these problems, you know, which would, like the heartbleed bug that the chairman mentioned in SSL, that was an out-of-bounds read that would have been prohibited by memory-safe language. WannaCry was an out-of-bounds write. So, you know, this is a really, this would solve a lot of problems. But I'll tell you this, as a programmer, when I was writing software, I hated memory-safe languages. And the reason is performance, because if you've got something, every time you want to read from memory or write from memory, you've got this, you know, cyber overlord that's determining whether or not you're allowed to do it. That takes performance away from your software. And in an era when we're talking about AI applications that are very performance intensive, you know, how do you balance those two priorities where we're giving up, you know, performance by a factor of probably 2 or 3 times to solve problems that occur, you know, once in a trillion times? So, you know, how do you balance that, those two priorities when you're talking about memory safety?
It's a great question, and this is one place where Moore's law continues to be on our side, right? Because
Well, to the extent that it
has proven
continues,
to be
yeah.
unabated. The cost of being able to perform a certain number of operations per second continues to drop. The cost of storage, all that, continue their projections, right? So, but we've also found in the last couple of years real advances in languages like Rust and Go that have allowed us to build memory-safe functions and software in memory-safe languages that approach, in some cases, even exceed the performance of C code. In some really low-level functions. So there's been really exciting advances in the last few years, and I think the time is ripe to really consider looking at a lot of fundamental libraries and parts of the internet architecture, such as the software that runs the domain name system, as opportunities to, again, eliminate entire categories of software vulnerabilities.
Sure. So how do you do that? Do you evangelize memory-safe languages through educational outreach to programmers that say that some of these? Yeah.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. You also try to resource the teams to go and build that software directly. Again, very highly leveraged because it can be shared with everybody very quickly. But it doesn't take a whole lot. A few developers at the peak of their level, a few more folks to evangelize and help build that. But the number of people who run domain name servers out there is actually, you could probably count them on 3 or 4 hands to cover the majority of the internet. And so there's a couple of very strategic places where you could have a tremendous impact.
Right. Thank you. Well, I see I'm out of time. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
We'll now recognize Representative Stevens for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the America Competes Act directs NIST to address or assess security risks in open source software and create guidance to help organizations maintaining open source code. Ms. Koran, we've heard from obviously many stakeholders that NIST cybersecurity guidance is often hard to adopt, especially by smaller entities. And this seems even more challenging in the open source context, where many software packages are managed by, they're managed by smaller teams. So what steps can NIST take to make it easier, or just to make it as easy as possible for the open source community to adopt NIST cybersecurity guidance?
Well, one of the problems that I've noticed, in my time in both industry and the public sector is the digestibility of it. It's very easy for government to kind of spend all the resources that they want to kind of, get the tooling and stuff in place. One of the biggest challenges there is to adopt those standards and frameworks into tools that are consumable by smaller groups such as developers or smaller and medium-sized businesses that don't have those types of resources. So potentially, pairing with some of the places like Open Software Security Foundation and whatnot, that is using the same open source type of model to provide those, audit capabilities and those packages that are kind of, I wouldn't say downscale, but more or less a community edition in a way, to allow them to, consume and then apply those standards and guidances. The other issue too with NIST is it's also very academic. It needs to be written in a plain language that someone can basically, a more simple guidebook to address, how to apply that to their own current problems. A lot of the stuff that is written is not situational to, particular, a small business, putting someone in their shoes as you're writing guidance. Those are some steps that NIST can take, is to kind of think less of the more like I'm an academic writer here to basically create these controls, but apply them more like, hey, I'm in a certain situation. Here's kind of a step through to work through those processes.
Great. So I also believe that education and training will be a key part of securing the open source ecosystem. Many developers aren't focused on security and may not know what resources and tools exist to ensure that they are developing secure software. Ms. Koran, could you elaborate on how we can leverage the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education at NIST to help make open source developers more security minded?
One of the things is marketing. Awareness is one of the biggest challenges. The security communities, I wouldn't say necessarily insular. We exchange ideas at security conferences like DEF CON or B-Sides and so forth. But for developers, there's stuff like Usenix and so forth there. But for just your average developer, or even somebody who's coding as part of a smaller business, they're not necessarily aware of that. So I hate to say it, as an advertising campaign, make this stuff aware, buy some ads on things like, hey, you're a developer, here's some things to make your code secure.
Yeah.
Awareness is the biggest challenge of all of this. And we've got to kind of market the same way that, all the scam artists tend to do.
Well, and there's conferences, there's convenings, there's opportunities to do that. And Mr. Behlendorf, what education and training activities is OpenSSF engaging in, and how can the federal government bolster cybersecurity education in open source communities?
Right. Well, we've built a really 30 hours of courseware available through edX, as well as through the Linux Foundation's own training platform that teach, again, the fundamentals of secure software development. This has to do with everything from has your open source project developed a team to respond to security issues, to are you fuzzing your code and doing other kinds of testing? And this is content that's been taken by about 10,000 people. We'd love to see that more hundreds to thousands to millions of people. We're starting to explore partnerships with educational organizations, as well as with companies who might require that of their own developers before they contribute to open source projects on that company's behalf.
Yeah.
And we're also looking at ways to try to think about if you're choosing between two software packages and one of them, the core developers on that have taken and can demonstrate that they've taken this course, you might lean your decision about which software package to use towards the one that has those developers with those credentials associated with it. So I'd love to explore efforts with the federal government to expand and as Emily referred to market the availability of these platform of the courseware.
Great. Well, thank you. Listen, I'm out of time, but this is obviously a hot hearing. So with that, I'll yield back.
We'll now recognize Representative Feenstra for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all the testimony from all our witnesses. It's very impressive. Mr. Behlendorf, in your testimony, you mentioned that very few software developers ever receive a structured education in security fundamentals and often learn the hard way on how their work can be attacked. I'm a bit of an academic myself, and I was wondering what steps need to be taken to address educational gaps for software developers. Is there anything that we can do, to mitigate some of these things up front?
Well, early in my career, I became a fan of a Usenet news group called Comp.Risks, which was a narrative-focused space where people talked about here's how the software has failed in spectacular ways. And it was a way of humanizing some of the root causes for these big failures and understanding why they happened in a way that doesn't assign guilt, doesn't try to look for who the bad actors are, but simply to say, here's where even the best of intentions, the best of processes have sometimes fallen down. And I think in computer science education, even as we talk about that in great elementary schools or high schools, we talk about the way that developers, most of whom I know are self-taught, come up to speed and start working with different languages. Inserting that into all those different kind of informal types of engagements, I think is critically important. I think also approaching trade schools, HBCUs, other places where so many of the future workforce is being trained is important. It's not frankly a lot of content. It doesn't require hundreds or thousands of hours of teaching to get across some of the basic principles of how your software can be used in widely different ways than you might have expected, and how to prepare for that, how to take a belt and suspenders approach to it. So lots of different answers to that question.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments, Mr. Behlendorf. I think you're exactly right. I think there's got to be some parameters, and I also think that people have to be understanding of what they're getting into and the concerns that could occur if they started going down the path and what could actually happen. Mr. Knausenberger, last summer, a JBS support plant in Iowa halted production after it was targeted by a ransom attack. How would improving software supply chain security assist with combating the scourge of ransomware like the attack that hit JBS? What are your thoughts on that?
All right, thank you for the question. So first I'll say, with securing the supply chain, the key steps are know where your software came from.
That can be a challenge, by the way.
Yes, it can be a huge challenge. Scanning consistently, doing continuous monitoring in your environment, and above all, keeping your software up to date and having processes that allow you to very quickly see what is not up to date, what is exploitable. But there are a lot of other attack vectors there that go beyond the software supply chain. And I believe in that case, it was a pretty concentrated server attack by a sophisticated adversary. And from what I recall reading in the press, the company did exactly what they should do. They had encrypted backups. They had counsel ready to go and recovered pretty well from that attack.
So I tend to agree. How does the communication get pushed when something like this happens? So other, packing plants, other things, don't happen. I mean, I'm sure there's a direct source of, hey, we're going to go after these type of organizations. Is there quick communication that can preempt some of this from happening to others once it does happen?
There is a lot of communication between companies that do ransomware negotiations. There are individuals that comb the dark web specifically for looking for threats. There's a lot of sharing among government entities to help get after this, and of course, sharing with companies that might be affected when it happens. But we can't catch everything.
No, absolutely. I got a quick question, Ms. Koran. In your testimony, you discuss how we often look at NIST and the National Cybersecurity Center for Excellence as essential players in interfacing with the open source community, with the guidance and standards they provide. But how we also need to learn how to lean on them for their methodologies for software assessments and validation. Can you expand just a little bit on this? I've got about 20 seconds left.
Yeah, the fact is they already use this for validating encryption standards and so forth. A similar model of being able for critical software packages to also offer that capability. Again, like I said in my statements, is to use that matchmaking capability. It's an awareness issue more than anything, and then to resource that properly so that if we do have critical software packages from the open source community, make that available to them so they can actually go through that process of assessment and validation.
Wonderful. Thanks for those comments, and I yield back.
Thank you, and we'll now recognize Representative Tonko for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning to our witnesses. Thank you to the chairs and ranking members for holding this joint subcommittee hearing. I would also like to welcome and thank the witnesses for being here and sharing information with us. Open source software, or OSS, is not isolated to one nation or to one industry. These projects, as we all know, are ubiquitous, supported by a diverse community of volunteers that collaborate to develop the software through innovation and open discussion. Lucky for us, the U.S. is home to many of the developers of the open source software that are used around the world. As we become increasingly reliant on tech, the federal government has an interest in building a closer relationship with the private sector to indeed influence and invest in the security of OSS projects. In our rapidly evolving world, this is an effort that we want to be global leaders in. Mr. Behlendorf, in your testimony, you mentioned that open source development and security work is inherently international, and that several foreign governments are developing their capabilities with respect to OSS. How would you recommend that the U.S. government take a leadership role in this space?
Thank you for the question. So the private sector has recently developed an approach among companies for whom software is not their primary function. Organizations like Walmart and Target and Home Depot have all recently opened open source program offices. These are departments within, sometimes within the IT department, sometimes within legal or marketing, but there are functions within a company that coordinate and help harmonize the engagement of that organization with all the open source projects that that company might depend upon, and even the new ones that might come out, and the contributions upstream that come from that company. I believe a similar function inside of federal agencies would help ensure very much a harmonized approach to that. It's very synonymous with the creation of a CTO office within many of the federal agencies and other things that have spawned out of the U.S. Digital Services and the GSA to be helpful in really building a technical capability inside of different federal agencies. Finding a way for those agencies to know how to engage with the open source community is really essential. In my testimony, I provided some other suggestions on ways for the federal government to engage with open source projects and approach them. I think the most interesting angle on this is the federal government is a major user of open source software, and like many other users, is a stakeholder in its success, and can approach that as a peer rather than as a in a top-down regulatory kind of
Thank you. I appreciate that. And are there any best practices that our global allies have found to be useful in addressing OSS security concerns?
In addressing security concerns, we've seen countries like France and Taiwan and others recognize the role that the use of open source software can play in enhancing resilience. And again, very much it's about funding operations to be able to build that capacity within their own organizations, within those governments, to be able to engage with open source and understand where the risks lie, how to make smart choices about which technologies to adopt. and where potentially to invest. I do want to note, as perhaps an example, as I did in my written testimony, the investment that the State Department made in digital privacy tools over the last 10 years that helped advance the protections for communication in very sensitive areas in a way that helped everybody globally and not just U.S. citizens or U.S. interests. And so, we're seeing that start to emerge from other countries as well, a recognition that there is that collective interest, and actually not even just governments, but international organizations like the WHO, who recently launched their own open source program
Thank you.
in the same way.
Thank you. Do any of our other witnesses care to share any thoughts on this, on these concerns?
I'm happy to share that
Sure.
through Platform One, we are also engaging with allies and sharing code with Five Eyes. And across our international community, we do our best to share code functionality as well as cybersecurity concerns, and to proactively across governments as well share those cybersecurity concerns.
Sure. And many of you suggested that federal engagement in open source will be key to promoting security. So, Mr. Behlendorf, can you speak to the costs associated with third-party code reviews and the potential benefits of continuous investment in the top 100 OSS projects? And we only have seconds remaining, so perhaps give it to us in a nutshell.
The benefit of a third-party code review is having a second or third or fourth set of eyeballs on not just the code you've written, but your assumptions and the features and all that kind of thing. And I typically an open source project to do that costs anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 to really do this thoroughly. And that seems like a lot of money when you're one open source developer, but when you realize the impact that we could have mitigated by preventing something like some of the major breaches we've seen, major problems we've seen, it's an infinitesimal amount for the benefit that we would get.
With that, I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And now we will now recognize Representative Gonzalez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses and to the other members. It's very refreshing to have genuine experts amongst the membership of Congress on this issue. It's fun hearing Chairman Foster and Olber Nolte share their experiences. Dr. Lohn, I want to start with you. As co-chair of the AI caucus, it's interesting to hear your perspective on how the AI community views open source software and its perspectives on sharing. I think the benefits are clear, but as you noted, it is imperative to better prepare for potential attacks. In your testimony, you noted that if adversaries, particularly China, make the most capable models, then developers in the U.S. would face an unwelcome choice between capability and security. What are the ways, or what's the best way that we can ensure that this does not happen and we're not forced to make that difficult trade-off?
Thank you for your question. I think that there are a bunch. One of the ways that I would start with is just tracking where the progress is across different subfields of artificial intelligence within language models or image processing, surveillance, and making sure that we're near the front or at the front in all of those, and tracking where we're falling, or where China is gaining on us, or where we have a large lead. And then just understanding if we can prioritize which AI systems we're most interested in protecting, and understanding which libraries and resources, data sets, and models are the foundations for building those. Then we can track what the performance benchmarks are for those systems. If we need to, we could provide funding to help support progress in a subfield that's lacking.
Thank you. And then you also noted China's making a push to create programming resources for building systems and the network infrastructure to provide them. If you were to look at it from a competitive standpoint, how close are they to having similar or the same technological capabilities as the United States and/or our allies?
In some fields, they're very close. In other fields, not so much. In terms of the network infrastructure for distributing, they're developing their own, but their popularity is way down from where we are. And so in terms of the technical capabilities, that exists. They can distribute the infrastructure. In terms of the popularity, it's still far behind, but that could change depending on how we promote or how we cut off accesses.
So you said some they're close, others not so much. Which ones are they closer on, and what gives you the most concern when you look at that?
The ones that they're closer on are in image processing and and in surveillance stuff. They focus a lot on surveillance technology, and so in a lot of ways they've pushed the frontiers there, and they've been making a push to be competitive in the biggest, most impressive areas, which currently are large language models. They've created some models that are very large, which is impressive, although they haven't published their performance, so we can't do an apples to apples comparison.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have, and I yield back.
Representative Caston will now be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I want to echo Mr. Gonzalez, and I am not remotely the computer programmer that our chairman or ranking member are. But I am a big open source advocate. My undergraduate degree was in biology, worked as an entrepreneur for a while, and I sort of feel like it's a bottom-up versus top-down control question. I'm pro-evolution. I'm pro-free markets for the same reason I'm sort of intrigued by open source. However, being opposed to central planning is not the same as being an anarchist. And I wonder if you can sort of stay with that metaphor. My question is for, my initial question is for Dr. Lohn. We've created this AI resource research task force as part of the bill we passed here in 2020. And as you look to their report that's going to come out this summer, as they go through to develop these trusted versions of AI resources that you talked about in your testimony, would you like to see them say there's a protocol by which we identify that these resources are trusted and viable, or rather that there is an ecosystem we've evolved that ensures that trusted resources come out of that ecosystem? Because in our markets, we have contract law, we have tort law, we have liabilities, we have all the things you need to make a market work. And as you think about how to create an ecosystem that provides trusted AI resources, do you think this is an ecosystem design problem, or somebody actually going in and designing the? Does that metaphor hold up? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it does. I think that metaphor holds up in a lot of different contexts that are relevant to this conversation. Specifically to your question with the AI research resource, I can see both working. It would even be a step up for me to just see a label where somebody has come in and said, this resource, we know who built it, we have it has been hashed, we know exactly what it is, and it's got a chain of custody that we understand. That gets an A. This other resource was made by a whole bunch of people that we can't speak to. That gets a C. Even if you don't actually provide the resource, if you just provide a labeling for it, I think that would be a step up. If you can,
it strikes me as sort of analogous to the sort of scientific research that we have a peer review process, and yes, you can do unpeer reviewed science, but we know how to judge that, right?
Exactly. Something like that would be very helpful. And from the top-down, bottom-up perspective, I think that's a really good analogy too, where a lot of the research into what are the vulnerabilities we need to be worried about is being done bottom-up, but their academics often chase the most interesting problem, not the most relevant one. So I think that government has an opportunity to say, these are the problems that we find most relevant. Please also be interested.
And so I want to be quick because I want to get to Ms. Knausenberger before I'm done, but do you think that in this model, the scientific review example I gave, those controls really came from the community? In markets, the controls came from government that set the rules. I don't know how you enforce property rights from the community. Government had to be there. Do you think Congress needs to do more to enforce the rules, or do you think the ecosystem itself is going to evolve these rules on their own?
I'm a little bit worried that the incentives are too far off, that people don't appropriately weight the impact of a cyber breach until it's too late. And so I would maybe advocate for a little bit of push from government side. Okay.
So Ms. Knausenberger, I'm going to leave with a hugely meaty question for you that's unfair in a minute, but be that as it may. As I think about these open source tools in a military context, the rules that we have, if an adversary of ours came and sent a commando unit to disable huge parts of our military equipment, that would be an act of war. We have all sorts of rules. We understand what that means. If they come in and disable the code that runs that military equipment, it's unclear what happens. This is way beyond the purview of the Science Committee, but do we need some kind of a Geneva Convention for cyber warfare? How do we make sure that we have the protections? Because we can put all the rules in place that we want for ourselves, for our country, but I've got to believe you stay up at night wondering about rules that apply in other countries, and we can control our AI, but if China or Russia does something differently, we're beyond the pale. Should we be thinking more about international law in this context?
So yes, 20 seconds left to, that is very meaty. I will say that when there is a kinetic effect, it's very clear how we handle things. In the cyber realm, there's some very healthy policy debate right now on where those red lines are, and I think folks well above my pay grade will determine that. But we do take our software supply chain, our cyber posture very, very seriously, and we are investing heavily in this area, especially after we've had a number of very solid lessons. I guess that's it.
Well, I guess,
Unless there's traffic outside the building.
Well, I guess, and maybe we can follow up off the record, but I'd like, and this may be more for a classified briefing, frankly, but I'd like to understand if you had knowledge that a foreign actor came in, interfered with our systems through making changes in our code that destabilized our systems, compromised our national security, do you feel that we actually have appropriate recourse that we would have if that was a kinetic event? And if not, how do we protect ourselves? Because it feels like a barn door to me that we've never truly addressed.
I think we should follow up.
Thank you. You go back.
Thank you. And Representative Carey will now be recognized for 5 minutes. Oh, Representative Baird will now be recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate all the chairs and ranking members putting together this kind of a session. And I always have find it very informative when we have experts like the witnesses we have here today to share their experiences with whatever the issue may be. But so my question in the area that we really haven't touched on, I don't think, is the public-private sector and the partnerships in that area. So how can the federal government, and this question goes to all the witnesses, how can the federal government, including the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, most effectively collaborate with industry and other stakeholders to help secure open source software? And if we do that, what policy changes can help secure the ecosystem? Ms. Grant, if you want to start.
Sure. So I was thinking about the comments I had made in my written testimony regarding the concept of carrier of last resort, where, from telecom ideas is that your local telephone company has to provide you local telephone service, and they're the ones that are there, even if through competition you have cable companies and whatnot. We have a lot of potentially abandoned software projects out there that are part of critical infrastructure. They're old. We have to think about like what's out there versus what's to come. And using the government's scale, size, and matchmaking capability to find potentially abandoned projects or those that are in need of resources and do that matchmaking. NIST can analyze where those are going to be most effective within the industries that that's used at, but also in more of an agnostic way, they can kind of pick the best experts to kind of assist with that, or again, work with like OpenSSF to find willing partners to actually help take over some of those projects as well, or at least find those resources.
Thank you. Ms. Knausenberger, care to comment?
Certainly. I appreciate the question and the previous answer. We are pretty new, I would say, in our open source journey in the Department of Defense, at least as far as embracing it publicly. We do have a voting membership on the CNCF. We are encouraging vendors to come work with us and allowing our software developers to contribute back to the code base as part of their normal coding duties. I do want to make just an invitation to my fellow witnesses to come and partner with us even more fulsomely. We would love your direct input, and this is something that's very important to me and to our department.
Mr. Behlendorf?
I'm always hesitant to come to any group of people with an open hand and ask for money, and very much I'm not doing that here. The private sector is organizing a series of efforts to try to systematically improve the state of security across the open source landscape. Maybe the ones I've talked about in written testimony, other groups out there, and all of those groups find themselves short of the resources they would really like to be able to be as comprehensive as they would like to be. Some of those plans are very specific, such as recoding things in memory safe languages, as we've talked about. Some of them are very broad, such as what would it take to fund security audits and remediations of the top 100 or 200 or 500 open source projects each year. There's a certain degree of scale that government can bring, and scale representing the collective interests of all Americans that would really benefit certain key ways. And so happy to explore further those opportunities with all of you and with others in government.
Thank you. Dr. Lohn?
Thank you. I think there are, so the AI community has been judged as not wanting to work with the government, but that was several years ago, and further studies have found that was drastically overstated, and there is a lot of interest in working with government. I think that there's an opportunity to do more placements, people who come in and work within parts of government, parts of DoD, perhaps for short stints of time, either part-time or full-time, and then go back to their positions. I think that exchange might be even more valuable than some of the financial opportunities. So creating those positions and opportunities for lateral temporary transfers.
Thank you. Thank all the witnesses for sharing with us today. And I've got about 15 seconds left, so I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back his 15 seconds. Next, the chair will recognize a representative from North Carolina. Representative Ross, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for holding this hearing, Chairwoman Stevens, Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Feenstra, and Ranking Member Obernolte. And thanks to all of the witnesses for being here today. I'm so glad that we're holding this timely hearing, given the prevalence of open source software and the work being done in my district in this space. I'd like to start my questioning by asking unanimous consent to enter into the hearing record a statement from Red Hat, a homegrown North Carolina global innovation success story from my district on why we need a holistic approach to software cybersecurity as embodied in the administration cyber executive order.
Without objection.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. For any of our witnesses, the open source security vulnerabilities seem, of course, highly concerning. Are there any signs that investments made in response have been yielding results? So, for example, I note that in the Senate Homeland hearing on Log4j, a company in my district, Cisco Systems, indicated that they had about 5 times faster response to Log4j this past year as compared to the similarly widespread open SLL heartbleed vulnerability in 2014. What can we learn from this experience and the vulnerabilities that are both more rare and more quickly remediated in the future? And that's to anybody.
Perhaps I'll jump in and start. You know, we as humans are very bad at evaluating the long tail risks where something bad that is very unlikely to happen does happen and causes all of us to scramble. We also need to acknowledge that any non-trivial amount of software is likely to have a defect that has yet to be discovered, right? And so there is a constant game afoot at not only enabling innovation, enabling the development of new code, but doing even more to progressively add more controls, more ways of monitoring, more ways of testing to try to find and discover new kinds of vulnerabilities. Nobody here, I think, could sit here and say we've got the key to being able to prevent the next Log4j from ever happening, right? But we do see in things like I mentioned the Project Zero research at Google that looked at response times to security vulnerabilities discovered as the beginnings of some econometrics around trying to evaluate that. We also recently worked with Harvard to publish something called the Open Source Census 2, which tried to identify what are the most critical open source projects out there, and asked which ones of those have adopted the best practices around security. And we plan to evolve that further into something akin to a dashboard to try to drive a race to the top, so to speak, amongst the popular open source projects to adopt more practices and more scanning and be more proactive about being able to validate their security research. In fact, most people will tell you, if you really do care about security, then when you're evaluating open source software, you look not just for the number of GitHub stars, an indication of popularity, but you look at how many vulnerabilities have been found and fixed. Because I'd much sooner trust the package that had a lot of vulns found and fixed quickly than the one that in which they haven't yet been discovered or fixed, right? So we are getting better at this. We still don't have a great, bullet point metric to be able to illustrate, how much metric progress we're making, but this is an area of active research in our field.
Does anyone else have anything to add? It looks like
Yeah. As a former computer security incident responder, it's yet never a matter of if, it's a matter of when. As you mentioned about the speed of the response, is that companies, as they've started to consuming the software, have plans how they're going to respond to an event. So that's not just a particular technical looking at the code, that's the integration of your operations teams, the rest of security teams. That's also part of all of this, is knowing what to do when something does happen. So as part of that investment is looking, again, speaking to the prior representative statements, it's a holistic approach. It's not just one narrow thing. And that's where we actually need to focus on, is an entire integration of the response and look at things holistically about how we structure and architect things.
Well, I see my time's about to expire. Thank you so much to the witnesses. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Oklahoma. Representative Bice, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me throw this out to all of the panelists today. There has been a lot of discussion about open source approach versus closed source. Can you expand on the security concerns of open source, and also maybe what are some of the latest techniques that we're utilizing to try to secure it? So for example, tokenization, or what are we doing to try to secure code currently? Happy to.
I'll jump in briefly. So really the same concerns are there, whether it's commercial software or open source.
Okay.
But if it's open source software, you have the power of the crowd looking at it, and then you can also run your own tests internally because it is open code. You can run all of the, you can redo the work yourself if you so choose. With commercial software, you can't see the source code. You do have situations where, like with SolarWinds, you could have a sophisticated adversary come in, inject malware, and have it be months before anyone knows that there's a problem. Whereas in the open source community, we've seen with a number of examples that we just catch it faster, we can push it faster, we have more people trying to fix it faster and spread the word. Whereas the commercial side, you have some really smart companies working on it, but we might not know about it as soon.
Anyone else want to elaborate on that?
I was going to say, sorry, jump in this. As a former CTO where I led development teams, one of the challenges is the gluing together of stuff. It's not always just one package that's consumed. As I mentioned in my opening statement, was that the fact that it is put together, and while they're developed, they can be valid in the state that they're in, but you can't necessarily dictate how they're actually glued together. So as you use multiple packages, you have that particular challenge of then doing incomplete systems test rather than just looking at the code base itself. And that's one of the challenges here of looking at something as an automated code check, that yes, it may pass those particular evaluations, but it's up to the consumer, whether it be an enterprise, organization, or an individual, to also go through an end-to-end testing. So that's part of that education, part of those capabilities, and part of those types of services that need to be made available, not just to developers, but to organizations and industry.
Fantastic.
Those have been some great answers. Culturally speaking, there's a greater emphasis on security in the open source software community. There used to be very much a perspective of, caveat emptor. I'm just throwing this out there. Anyone who wants it is welcome to it, but buyer beware, and let us know if you find any bugs. And increasingly, we see open source foundations formalize a structured security team and incident response team within the project itself to, in some cases, pay for part-time or full-time security researchers who do nothing but try to improve both the underlying code as well as the processes that lead to the development of that software. Third-party audits are an increasingly important part of release processes. I see many open source projects that before they release the next .0 version of their software will hire an outside firm to come in and review and audit the code and challenge the things that they found. So it gives me a lot of hope. But there also is a very long tail that is getting longer and longer of very, very small components that when aggregated together, create interesting things, but where there's perhaps less oversight. You're probably familiar with the phrase that has been around the open source community a while: with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Well, we have a problem with a critical number of eyeballs on enough open source projects, even sometimes highly dependent ones. So one thing we're really trying to do is just make sure that we find the pieces that are critical, find the ones that are under-resourced, then where we can direct resources of whatever form are required to increase the level of trust that we might have in that component, that we do so.
Thank you for that. Final question with just a minute left. How has Executive Order 14028 on improving the nation's cybersecurity been leveraged to bolster open source software security? Has there been progress, and obviously there's gaps, but where do those gaps remain?
I'll jump in on that. It has been tremendously helpful to the folks who've been working on the software bill of materials space for a number of years. Initially, much of the SBOM activity has been focused on licensing and conformance. In fact, the Linux Foundation has facilitated the development of a standard called SPDX, which has become a very widely used standard, but used in ways that haven't yet risen to the surface. And what was very helpful about EO 14028 was setting the tail end of that process, setting a demand for it that has started to drive that demand upstream to the open source projects that depend upon it. So we're seeing a shift towards SBOMs. We're seeing it starting to be baked into developer tools and in major supply chains as well. So it has been very helpful in driving that ubiquity.
Perfect. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And Representative Perlmutter will be recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I came in a little late, so I apologize. But I did hear, Mr. Behlendorf, when you said you were more comfortable if you saw that there had been a number of vulnerabilities found in a particular piece of software, you felt more comfortable about that than one that didn't have so many found. And that just was counterintuitive to me. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? And Ms. Knausenberger, maybe you can, because you talked about SolarWinds and the commercial versus open source.
Yeah, I should clarify, found and fixed, not just found and left in their current state, because that indicates people care. That indicates people are looking and scrutinizing it. And I've very rarely seen software that you can use for any non-trivial purpose or amount of time that hasn't had a defect found in it. So it's a sense of health of a project that you find that people are looking for them, finding them, and that the project's own developers acknowledge those bugs and are ready to fix them. I much prefer that over the thing that looks and feels perfect and done and no bugs.
Okay.
Yes, that was a great answer, and I will agree. If there are no bugs found in a particular piece of software, it's because no one's looking. It's not because it's perfect, and it is a sign of pedigree to have lots of eyes using and really poking away at a piece of software. So it also engenders confidence to me.
And you may, all of you may have answered this before, but who is it? Who are those eyes? Who is the community? I mean, are they doing this for grins? Do they get paid? Who is it that's looking to see if there's a vulnerability?
So the top 4 contributors are Microsoft, Google, Red Hat, and Intel. And the Department of Defense is increasingly involved as well, looking and contributing back. There are people that are paid to also contribute to open source software, and I'm sure my fellow witnesses can jump in on that as well.
I mean, more often than not, it's not my nephew who's a super computer nerd, sitting in the basement looking to hack something.
Sometimes you trip over it. As part of building software systems, you may find that the code that you are intending to use between versions or new use of it creates an unexpected result. And that could be a bug or a vulnerability that is found. And hopefully, based on licensing or the policy of an organization, those changes do get floated back into the original code base. Sometimes it doesn't, just because of, sometimes the sensitivity of intellectual property of the organization that has actually integrated that. So it does run in conflict sometimes with the licensing. But others, obviously we do have a very robust security community that does, for grins and giggles, goes to like to poke at software, and the same thing that we use to secure it from the development standpoint, fuzzing and other tests are also used by adversaries, but they're just not reported.
Okay.
I'd like to
Go ahead. Somebody else.
Sorry, I'd just like to add that studies have found since the earliest days of open source that the vast majority of contributions that come into any major open source project come from developers who are using that code to solve a business problem, right? In some cases, it's to train themselves up, to further their careers, to get a bit of notoriety, or it might even be that nephew in a basement who has a brilliant idea that becomes the basis for the next cool thing. And the great thing is that all those interests and all those agendas can align and harmonize and create interesting and innovative code. The key is finding processes that allow for more than one set of eyeballs to look at code before it's released, processes that test and vet for off by one errors that lead to memory vulnerabilities and the like. So from a motivations point of view, it really is industry and individuals working voluntarily together, but to solve real world problems.
May not be able to get this answer in before my time expires, but what role do you think open source coding software has in modernizing our electrical grid as we add more and more renewables? If anybody can answer that.
I'll jump in and say, at the Linux Foundation, we have a project called LF Energy, which is a collaboration between some of the major grid operators around the world and hardware and software providers to them to develop the next set of software infrastructure for totally focused on renewables and microgrids and enabling a much greener kind of future. And so we're seeing active involvement from industry on that. But we've also seen the solar community working on open source software to tie into grids, to manage resources in a really explosively cool kind of way. We're really excited to be leading that project.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back to the chair.
Thank you. And Representative LaTurner will now be recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Knausenberger, you discussed in your testimony how the Iron Bank repository can reduce supply chain risk. Can you elaborate on Iron Bank's levels of security and provide insight into whether non-DoD entities are able to replicate this effort or security components of it?
Certainly. So first, the way that we secure our open source software leveraging Iron Bank, we start with the onboarding process where we validate the supplier identity of the code. We then harden. We scan for vulnerabilities and dependencies. We do policy configuration and scanning. We ensure that we are doing automated updates and have a process to pull those in. We do delivery and auditing as well. And there are a lot of things that come into that process, as well as an SBOM. So those are the things that we are doing within Iron Bank, and we do that. Some of that work is done organically. Some of that work is done through partners, and largely commercial partners. As far as private citizens or the public leveraging Iron Bank, it is available and itself an open source product. And we have, again, heard of at least one commercial bank leveraging Iron Bank, and a variety of defense contractors and other interested parties.
Thank you. Ms. Koran, in your opinion, would cracking down on waste, fraud, and abuse in federal agencies like HHS, for example, help mitigate cybersecurity threats by disincentivizing bad actors?
It could. Unfortunately, it's a resourcing issue again. I remember being on some of the security mailing lists and whatnot, and usually at most of these health organizations, whether it be hospitals or things that are places that grants are made to, it's one IT person doing multiple roles. So sometimes it's not necessarily out of malice, but it's also out of available resources. But also one of those cases is even at HHS, which is the biggest IG, the cybersecurity oversight was really small group out of the entire organization. So it's also a scaling issue just to be able to provide that level of oversight. It could help crack down on it, but it needs definitely a lot more resourcing. And I'm sure that's the case with many of the other agency OIGs.
Sure. You stated in your testimony that triaging software vulnerabilities is hampered by a lack of technology literacy among the people in charge of responding to such events. In your opinion, how should the government fix these miscommunications to speed up future response times?
Well, for one is definitely staff experts like the rest of the panel here in places where they can actually do the most good. My time at OMB, most of those folks were not technical, even in the CIO's office. So, educating on Heartbleed, I had to explain, the overflow and what that actually meant in terms that were meant, for folks who are non-technical. That level of literacy needs to be higher up in the food chain. And while that can happen as our generations start to take over more, as some of the older generations retire and we move up. But, in this case, we can't wait. So at some cases, it's just a matter of pairing the right people in the right place at the right time.
Sure, I appreciate that. Dr. Lohn, in your testimony, you discussed how AI system models coming from our adversaries may back American software and AI developers into a corner. Can you explain what you mean when you say the United States would have to choose between capability and security?
Yes, if the best model, so all right, so when someone is building a new AI system, they rarely design it from scratch. That can cost millions of dollars. And so what they'll often do is download a model as a starting point and then use a small amount of data to tweak it up. But when they're trying to decide which model to start from, they choose the most powerful one that exists or near to it. And if currently most of those are American made, or some of our allies. But if that were made by an adversary, then you would have to choose between taking this one that wins on all the benchmarks or taking the 10th place model or the 2nd place model and using that as your starting point. If that most powerful model is an adversary made one, they can embed triggers in it that they can use later on after the model has been retrained for its new purpose.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And I'd also like to mention for those members who are attending either in person or virtually that we're going to attempt a second brief round of questions if we have time. And we'll now recognize Representative Meyer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to touch a little bit on the conversation that Ms. Bice had a little bit earlier with Dr. Lohn. And it seems like one of the themes that's coming out here is this tension between, government shifting from an approach of propagating best practices to then expanding and setting some mandatory minimums within kind of federal supply chains and federal data or federal kind of IT infrastructure, and that the tension between the voluntary approach and more of a mandate or restrictions or certain minimums. From the NIST voluntary framework from the 2014 Executive Order 13636 for critical infrastructure, through to that White House EO 1428 from last May, for minimum standards for federal systems. Are there, we're kind of looking at the government's role vis-a-vis protecting and encouraging updates of whether it's the software bill of materials to get that full kind of codification of what's in the stack on the open source side. But so much of the perpetual vulnerabilities, and this came across in several of the testimonies, are just the failure to update even after an exploit is known, even after a patch is issued, and how that can take a very long time. The Log4j patch deployment took identified in a week, kind of take weeks to months, potentially years to be fully onboarded. Are there, apart from the government, apart from some of the kind of industry and nonprofit organizations that are represented here, and I just want to throw this out to the group, what role do, specifically with the commercial sector, what role do insurance providers who may be on the hook for a breach that results in data being compromised that has a financial impact, or investment firms? I mean, are there other entities that should be part of this conversation apart from just government, nonprofit, and some of the larger kind of commercial IT partners?
I'll jump in. I certainly believe that the insurance industry could have an important role to play, and we have not yet really seen them show up to the discussion. The insurance is how we brought greater degrees of safety to our transport systems, to many other parts of modern society. Many organizations do offer cybersecurity breach insurance and other kinds of risk insurance related to this, and they've had difficulty in finding premiums and pricing, as I understand it, that actually make for sustainable models. This is tied somewhat to the challenges we have in applying metrics to understanding just how secure is this bundle of software that we've deployed, or this cloud service that we're using as an enterprise. But with better metrics, with better monitoring, we can get, I think, to a model that works for the insurance industry. So it would be really eager to not only engage with them, but engage with many of you in government who oversee many of those activities to try to figure out how to encourage more bridge building there.
Thank you, Doctor. Anybody else want to offer input?
Yes. Yeah, definitely one of the challenges here, especially going back to Representative Vice's comment there, was that with a lot of the standards and everything, everybody looks at these as the high watermark, as the thing that they're going to only meet and meet there. But resilient systems, whether they be in critical infrastructure or your everyday business down the street that's consuming this, needs to build above that waterline, above that mark, so that if and when the event does occur, that they're resilient enough to sustain that and maintain their business and operations. And that's the biggest impact to global economies, is that resiliency thing. Looking at the Colonial Pipeline, looking at things such as solar winds, because the base was ever met. When they were hit, everybody scrambled and everybody panicked. And that's one of those cases of using that to drive better behavior in industry, is to look to go above and beyond. Just use that as that baseline to move rather than the roof.
Well, and certainly I also serve on the Homeland Security Committee, and I think while we're focusing on the role of NIST, CISA's role is also very critical here. But I think Ms. Koran, the point's very well taken on the high watermark and building above that line, because we can only look back to what has occurred and have to be focusing as well on what's coming down the pike. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And at this point, I think we have enough member interest for an additional round of questions. So I'll begin by recognizing myself. And my general question is, what's the future of automation in code verification? If in 10 years from now, or 20 years from now, or 6 months from now, are we going to actually be able to have most of these packages verified by some piece of code that you run on them when you attempt to update them? What's the sort of state of the art, and what is your guess for the anticipated state of the art over the next few years?
I'll jump in on that. Right now, current what are called static analysis tools, and even the dynamic analysis tools, the ones that look at running systems and try to look for vulnerabilities, these tools suffer quite a bit from what are called false positives. Developers who use them have to weed through a lot of signals that aren't really about vulnerabilities for the one or two pieces that actually do indicate some problems. So there is a ton of research now going into how to reduce those numbers of false positives. How do you make this tool perceived as productive and useful to developers as they look for that code? And then how do you turn that on at scale? We've done quite a bit at the OpenSSF in partnership with many of our members around looking at fuzzing, which is a way of throwing a ton of garbage data at a piece of software to understand how and when it might break, and looking at ways to try to automate that at scale across thousands or millions of projects at once. It is a very hard problem, but it is an area of active research in this space. I also think that the better we get at finding new ways to automatically detect and remediate vulnerabilities, the more kinds of new vulnerabilities we'll discover. Because the landscape always shifts, and what we need is a general capacity for not just finding and fixing bugs, but finding new kinds and fixing new kinds of bugs. And that's why what we call for in terms of investments really is on a persistent basis, rather than, okay, now we have security in our source codes and we can all go home.
And I was going to throw something in there too, is you give somebody a problem and there's going to be 10 million different ways to solve it. For large programs and open source packages, you can enforce standards of people, how they code, different things that they need to do. But the wonderful thing about open source is that anybody can basically go and do it regardless of their skill level, their experience, and time doing this. So with AI, part of that, those models are going to be necessary to be checked. We can do some level of automation, but you go to some place like Stack Overflow, throw out a question, and you're going to have 100 different answers how to implement the exact same thing. Whether or not they're correct, some of them may be, some of them may not be. So as Brian mentioned about fuzzing, we will only catch a certain amount through some of that automated testing, but it'll still require some eyes and that rigor of being able to understand that you should code in a certain fashion. Providing core repositories of known checked methods and implementation standards are ways to do that. But until everybody's kind of on board or willing to follow those models, that's the challenge of humanity is, you have that level of creativity, want to kind of do it their own. So I think that's going to be our biggest challenge moving forward.
I would also just like to very quickly pipe in and say that there's an opportunity. There's a lot of focus on vulnerability discovery and patching. I think that the patching side, as the previous Congress member mentioned, is a big problem where there's a bigger opportunity to make a push. It's a harder problem, but there's more opportunity for gains.
All right. So at the macro level, we're already pretty automated across the community, even in the Department of Defense. Pretty much anything that we are building in the last few years has an automated pipeline. We also are really big on bringing in the hacker community after the fact to hack away at our systems and tell us maybe what we missed in production as well and in our development environments. But even there, when we see a particular play used more than once, we want to look at, well, how do we automate that play so that as we test this on the back end, we can become increasingly creative. We don't have to just do the things that we tested before. We do the same thing in our pipeline. As we notice that maybe we missed something, how do we give that feedback by adding a new tool, giving feedback to a vendor, et cetera. But automation plays heavily. I'd say we're more nascent in the way that we can automatically check algorithms, and that's just as a, as an industry. But I think that there will be a lot more automation leverage there in the future as we make just more advances.
Yeah. Did any of these tools flag Log4j?
So I think the key thing to understand there is that if you're using a scanning tool, it's not necessarily going to identify malicious code as much as it's looking for code that's going to break something or is incorrect or is a bug. And so a lot of vulnerabilities, it's not because the code was inherently wrong, it's that someone was very clever and they found a way to exploit something that was working in the code to do ill. And that's why it's so important that we continue to have the cyber research community engaged and the people that are using that code for business purposes engaged, because some of these things you're not going to find until you start hammering away at it, no matter how good you are.
My time is up, and I'll recognize Representative Obernolte for 5 minutes.
So let me start with Dr. Lohn. I'd like to continue a line of questioning that Congressman LaTurner had started. You were talking about the trade-offs between capability and security and discussing the possibility that a competitor such as China might introduce a very capable piece of open source software in the hopes that it would be incorporated along with perhaps an embedded security vulnerability into sensitive software. So my question for you is, how would one avoid that? Because as you've also said in your testimony, it can be very difficult, especially when you're talking about software related to AI. It's going to be very difficult to determine whether or not a vulnerability exists, even if it was put there intentionally. So what can we do to solve that problem?
That's a very good question. The first thing we could do is make sure that we have superior or competitive models of our own that we do trust. Short of that, trying to discover these, what they are sometimes called backdoored or Trojanized models is challenging. NIST has an effort right now called TrojAI, where they're trying to run competitions with many backdoor models where academics or researchers are trying to find new ways. That would be being able to detect whether a model has been Trojanized would be great. It's the ambitious solution, and I think that we should not put our eggs all in that basket. Trying to create our own competitive models is my primary suggestion, and then creating other like a diplomatic or bureaucratic means for gaining trust would be my second fallback.
So I'm just tunneling down on that, though. When we're competing, we're introducing competitive models that don't have those potential security vulnerabilities. I mean, it's difficult to do. You can't just monitor the marketplace for open source software, and every time a capable module is introduced from a question from a competitor, develop a better module. That's not what you're suggesting, is it?
What I'm suggesting is that we prioritize the AI applications that we're interested in, and then make sure that we have the talent and incentives to stay at or near the cutting edge in those particular areas.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is something we should talk some more about, because I think you've highlighted a very interesting and important potential problem. Ms. Koran, if I could ask a question of you, we have discussed through a couple of different lines of questioning today the administration's executive order from last year, and the consensus has been that it was a positive development. But in your written testimony, you had a somewhat different reaction to it. You called it a dark cloud over the agencies, and you feared it might, to quote you, stifle innovation and self-determination and put a chill over industry. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to give your point of view on that.
Yes, definitely. So one of the challenges, having been a federal CTO, was a lot of these times is it's usually you're already kind of doing the work that you're doing, and then you get an executive order or demand from another agency like CISA to go and do a thing, and that actually requires you to change, add a reporting capability to it, do some extra checks. You may have been doing some of that already, but the idea is now you have to comply. Then agencies, either through acquisitions through GSA via the Federal Acquisition Service and so forth, when they acquire software and services, it puts an onus on industry whether or not they want to comply, and it reduces the ability for agencies to kind of pick and choose from a better menu. One of the challenges about FedRAMP, which is the cloud security and compliance side of things, that's a very limited marketplace because it's such a high bar for a lot of companies to reach, and most of the ones who are innovating are small companies. Most of the ones you usually see in FedRAMP are ones who've had the time and the money to get there. So it does stifle innovation because it does remove the lack of choice and availability of software and services to agencies to work their mission.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I think you've highlighted a very important topic, which is the bond of trust that has to exist between government and the open source community, because without that bond of trust, neither of those communities can do their jobs. So, as you've expressed, the government's efforts in other areas to provide this kind of assistance have not been crowned with glory. So, I appreciate the viewpoint. It's something we'll have to work on. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, and we will now recognize Representative Perlmutter for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and the chair sort of prompted a question, as did the ranking member, talking about trust. So what happens if either in the original software or somebody from the online community turns out to be a bad actor? You find malicious software that appears to have either been it was intentionally placed there to be triggered at some later date. What happens, one, if you find that? What happens if you find somebody in the open source communities trying to create trouble with some sort of malicious effort? What happens to those bad actors?
Well, I'll share, there's an incident in 2020 where a research team at the University of Minnesota decided to test that very question and see whether the Linux kernel community would notice when they submitted a bug, like a software patch that had a backdoor embedded inside it. The patch came in, it started to work its way through the process, and within about 5 days, the developers, the maintainers on the Linux kernel, noticed the bug, noticed that it was intentional, responded by blackballing basically the entirety of the University of Minnesota IP address space from ever contributing again to the open source, to the Linux kernel. That might have sounded extreme, but the community, well-run open source projects have not only processes to detect these kinds of things that no matter how many tools you use, do still have to boil down to humans looking at what's coming through and evaluating and trying to understand what's really going on inside of the software source code, but also have strong social mores against that kind of contribution. Now, there are other open source projects without those kinds of processes, without even a lot of developers involved, sometimes modules that are really just written by one or two people. And in recent cases, such as you might have heard of colors.js, fakers.js, IPC.go, there have been modules written by one person or a small number of people. And as I understand it, they've all been either Americans or Europeans in these recent examples where they decided they would use that privileged position they have to put something in. And some of those got noticed very quickly. The ones that had inserted a cryptocurrency miner do tend to get caught pretty quickly because they drive your CPU crazy. But I think a space we have much less of a systematic solution for, except to say we should prefer those components that are built by teams rather than those components built by individuals. And I think you'll start to see more of that work its way into supply chain validation processes as well over time. I'll use this component that has more eyeballs on it, more positive attestations to the integrity of that software than this other piece that comes from an individual, no matter what IP address range, what company, what country. Let's look at the substance of what's been created.
You mentioned crypto in that answer. So I don't know how many thousand cryptos are out there now, types of currencies. But is there some, is the Treasury, we have defense here, but is somebody looking to see if those cryptos have some sort of malware in them, either intentional or not? I'm just curious whether that can create problems if we start taking cryptocurrencies generally as some sort of payment.
The answer is yes. A lot of people look at that because it automatically has built into it a bug bounty, where in many cases, if you're able to find a vulnerability in a major cryptocurrency platform, you get rewarded with the ability to mint new dollars or transfer funds to yourself. And so one thing we found is while there have been a lot of famous kind of hacks and famous compromises, that's a community that also perhaps takes security more seriously than many other parts of the open source community because the stakes are so much higher. And I think if we're looking for a space where zero trust is really a first principle, it's very much in that community. But it should absolutely be in our mind as we think about central bank digital currencies, the use of distributed ledgers for supply chain traceability, and these other kinds of opportunities that technology does provide.
Thank you. My time is about to expire. I'm going to yield back to the chair, and thank you for this hearing, Mr. Chair, Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you. And before we bring this hearing to a close, I want to thank our witnesses for testifying before the committee today. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and for any additional questions the committee may ask the witnesses. The witnesses are now excused and the hearing is now adjourned.